I'm selling what you're buying. What I've learned is the elevator pitches to employers don't necessarily work, particularly selling quote unquote physical therapy, because you don't buy physical therapy unless you have a known problem that physical therapy can be the solution. So I learned through the years to talk less about that and talk more about what do you like, what do you not like. The two common questions that I ask is, do you like your current health insurance arrangement, and do you think you get a good value? If both of those are yeses, then I'm going to ask you about your kids. On the flip side, if either one of those are like, dude, I hate this stuff, then it gets deeper and like, tell me why. What's the issue? And sometimes it's like, hey, we got a good price, but our employees hate it, and we got an answer for that.
This is The Direct Path, a show about the future of MSK care and the people who are bold enough to build it. Join us weekly as we talk with innovators who are challenging the status quo. Here's your host, Scott Hebert.
All right. Well, welcome again to this episode of The Direct Path. Today we have joining us Josh Bailey, Dr. Josh Bailey, I should say, President, CEO, Rehab Associates of Central Virginia, longtime friend, all around awesome dude, friend of APTA, and also one of the most knowledgeable voices I've spoken to in the world of direct contracting and physical therapy. So Josh, thanks so much for joining us today, man.
Thank you. What an intro. I can't live up to that.
You can live up to all around awesome dude for sure. I think that's a very fitting title. Well, Josh, I feel like maybe the best place to start here is give the folks listening in a little bit of your background about the practice you started over at Rehab Associates of Central Virginia, your kind of just quick intro of your path into the profession of physical therapy, and then we'll dive into how that intersects with direct care from there.
Sure. So I joined Rehab Associates actually 28 years ago. It's a 58-year-old business, and we all have had like minds, like missions over the years. So we ended up merging two practices into one to combine Rehab Associates. When I joined, we were, I think, 3 locations, and we're getting ready to open number 17 now. So slow but methodical growth. Our hedgehog concept is, orthopedic physical therapy. We do some other things, but only because people ask us to. And, I've been president of APTA Virginia and still chair their private practice section for the state. I'm also on the value-based committee and payment policy committee of APTA private practice, where I kind of manage the direct to employer contracting education for PPS.
Appreciate it, man. Well, I know that's something that a lot of our listeners have partaken in. Those of you who haven't cannot recommend highly enough the direct to employer services designation that the APTA puts on. Josh and the team there have done some tremendous work building an awesome foundation for any practice leader who's looking to start exploring the pathway towards direct contracting, specifically contracting with employers, which is one of the main reasons we wanted to have you on this podcast today. And pick your brain even more. Hopefully we can kind of get people's appetite up and interested and continue to have more folks learning from the awesome course you guys have put together there.
I think that'd be awesome. I think it's one of the biggest runways for physical therapists.
Yeah. I'm going to start the interview off today from a position that I like to ask a lot of practice leaders about, because I think it does set the stage well for the conversation we're going to have. I'll ask you, I think I know your answer because you've always historically been, I think, an optimist for someone I've spoken to. But the field of physical therapy over the next 10 years, are we trending in the right direction? Are we trending in the wrong direction? And why?
Man, I wish it was more than 10 years.
Well, you tell me, how far out should we look?
2037 and beyond, we're going to crush it. And I mean, ultimately, for the average PT practice, that's when, the baby boomers start to fade out, right? And you get into the Gen Xers moving into the federal payer space at CMS. And that's a much, much smaller group. So you're going to have a lot of commercial, a lot of direct, I think, contracts in that time frame. We'll be trending there over time. But, my calendar says 2037 and beyond is probably the big target.
And so really what you're saying is that there's a case mix challenge in the interim, whereas we see more and more folks shift to Medicare and the Medicare variants, these Medicare Advantage plans, which don't take me down that whole rabbit hole, but all the challenges we're seeing there. Really, your fear is as that population, that kind of bolus of our addressable market that we're treating grows, that's creating some real pressures for you guys.
Well, it is. I mean, obviously the last 5 years have been significant cuts. And, when you look at it in a cumulative impact in relationship to inflation, you know, we have 15% less reimbursement in the last 5 years with, you know, the same pressures, if not
Yep,
more.
even no more. Yep.
I mean, for those of us that practiced prior to 2005, like that, this is pretty hard.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
It feels like more headwinds than tailwinds in right now, but that's all the more reason why we should be talking about direct to employer contracting.
Yeah, no, that's the perfect transition. I'm curious for you, how did the choice to come to a direct contracted model kind of bubble to the surface? And at what point in your practice history did this become an obvious, like, hey, we need to go investigate this path?
Really, the genesis behind it was one of the large payers um, continue to make life harder, right? With utilization management, authorization, verification, peer-to-peer reviews, all those things that took time, took effort, took people, whether it's PTs or staff, took systems to utilize and brought in absolutely no income. And, it's like, man, this stinks. And as I talked to employers, I realized they hated it as much as we did because their life was getting more complicated. And, and expenses were increasing pre 2012. They were increasing 3, 4, 5%. And then post ACA, then you started seeing these 10, 15, 20% per year jumps for employers in their expense, and their employee satisfaction was waning around healthcare. So that just creates an entree of like, well, somebody ought to be able to solve this. Uh, and so maybe this is let's instead of three people in the conversation, maybe it only should be two.
Love that. Love that. That's the beauty of direct contracting, man. Get to cut out the middleman and focus on actually providing value. So it sounds like, for you guys at the end of the day, it was a payment per visit challenge that sort of opened up a door to say, how do we increase rate? And it seems like you found an aligned stakeholder. Is that fair to say?
I think that's part of it, but the other part of it is the administrative burden and the expense generated by that on the backside. Like what does it cost you to get paid? And then nowhere else, most businesses, there's no such thing as reimbursement payment.
Amen.
And, you go to the grocery store, if the loaf of bread's $5 and you only have four, you don't leave with 80% of the bread. You either get the bread or you don't get the bread. And if you're going to get the bread, you need to find another dollar because you need to pay it right then. And the grocery stores checked it off the box and you head on out and they're fine. You're fine. We don't live in that world. And so the reimbursement side of things at its most extreme, I think it was costing us 16%. And I couldn't do it with fewer people. I couldn't necessarily, at least back then, I couldn't use tools to replace that and automate it. Because I was, this was in the early days, you're on the phone. You're actually calling and trying to talk to a person who probably didn't even know what they were talking about, but um, I couldn't say that.
Yeah.
And I could only verify it if I called three times and got three different answers. I'm pretty sure none of those have a high probability of being correct.
Yep.
So, that overall expense on the backside, nobody was calculating as part of reimbursement. They were looking at what am I collecting per visit? And really that's the top line of the equation. The bottom line of the equation is what does it cost me to provide the visit? And then the third component is what does it cost me to collect the payment for a said visit? And you got to add all those things together before you determine if you're profitable or not.
Yep. Yep. A net rate becomes key. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's excellent. How long ago was this? When did you guys first kind of start taking a step towards a direct?
Well, our first contract is now 14 years old. Now, I started about 6 or 7 years before that, but I obviously didn't know what I was doing. And I got a lot of cold shoulders and a lot of, what are you talking about? But understand during, all that time, direct access was becoming a thing. I saw myself as an autonomous practitioner, but not always did the rest of the world agree with me. And so that was a bigger challenge in trying to change the entry point into the healthcare system. It was new. It was not commonplace. People were still looking at it from an insurance perspective, like, well, can you even do that?
Yeah.
Until it became legal. And in Virginia, our first real legislation was in 2006. That got us to the point where we could see patients at least for a period of time.
Yep, man, that's you really were a pioneer in that sense because, like you said, we're just seeing the repeatable models start to mature enough in physical therapy that we're seeing this be something that can be done. I can't even imagine doing this in a world where you were still struggling for direct access challenges. So super
Well,
impressive.
and it was not a repeatable model back then.
Yeah.
It was, scratching it on the back of a napkin. Would you consider this? Would you consider
Yeah.
that? I mean, it was spitballing ideas for the, win, win, win. I mean, pretty much any business deal that I go into, that's the way I'm looking at it. If it can't be win for, the patient, the employer, and the physical therapist, it's going to blow up.
So,
It might work
so
for a little bit, but
let's go down that. I love that. That's how we talk about it as well. As kind of this magical three-party win, where the employer saves money, the patient gets great access to care, oftentimes at little to no cost, or sometimes no cost at all, and the provider makes more money. Literally, the only entity that loses in this is that insurance middleman who's just been extracting value out of this the whole time rather than adding it. On that note, you know, I think one of the biggest questions folks have as they're starting to go down this road is they ask us, what am I selling? So why don't you kind of maybe describe, as you've matured and refined kind of that overall value proposition, what are you selling to get to that?
without being too tongue in cheek, I'm selling what you're buying.
That's fantastic. Let's go into it.
Because what I've learned is the elevator pitches to employers don't necessarily work, particularly selling quote unquote physical therapy, because you don't buy physical therapy unless you have a known physical therapy problem or a problem that physical therapy can be the solution. So I learned through the years to talk less about that and talk more about, what do you like? What do you not like? Kind of the two common questions that I ask is, do you like your current health insurance arrangement? And do you think you get a good value? And if both of those are yeses, then I'm going to ask you about your kids. This is probably more of a social interaction than it is a business interaction. On the flip side, if either one of those are like, dude, I hate this stuff, then it gets deeper and like, tell me why. What's the issue? And sometimes it's like, hey, we got a good price, but our employees hate it. Or to get the product that our employees think is valuable, it's just becoming insurmountable year over year. We're drowning in this. And then sometimes it's very pocketed, like, holy smoke, do you know how much an MRI costs? And of course now, people are talking about GLP-1s and, there's all these expenses that nobody's really attributing to physical therapy, but they're absolutely in the realm of physical therapy. 40% of your weight loss is muscle. Like, we got an answer for that. But if you go in talking about physical therapy, they're talking about GLP-1 drugs. There's no connection there.
I couldn't agree more. No, I mean, I think, despite being tongue in cheek, what you're really describing is a good discovery process. And I know that's one of the amazing pieces you guys really go into depth on in the direct to employer course that APTA puts on. But I agree is so important, right? Is understanding at the end of the day, the needs of these buyers. And fortunately for us in the industry, just so happens that almost all employers have a pretty big musculoskeletal cost problem or a care access problem or a premium increase problem, to your point. And so
Right.
it sounds like you're doing great discovery.
And I didn't even realize it was discovery. I mean, when I first started this, I was so green, and I was excited about physical therapy and, like I was an evangelist for physical therapists. And so I'm selling physical therapy and it was falling on deaf ears. And I didn't realize that I just was really bad at the sales process or the discovery process. And through time, I realized that, I had to change my approach. And in changing my approach, then I started getting a lot more traction. I started solving problems that solve problems for them, solve problems for the patient, solve problems for me. I'm like, oh, this is what I've been trying to do. I just was doing it wrong.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Perfectly well said. Let's maybe zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the industries, because I think when folks sort of try to, maybe problem number one, question number one we get is, what am I selling? And we say very similar to what you described, right? You're not selling physical therapy, I'll tell you that. But what you are trying to sell is a solution for these employers. Let's talk about the who, right? Who have you found? What types of industries are you seeing traction in? Where has worked? And on the flip side, also, what hasn't worked?
Sure. Well, let's start with what didn't work, because I think that might be the easier answer. Multinational, big multi-state, unless you have a relationship like Second Door that can carry you beyond your own geographical context. In the beginnings, those were really hard for me. They're like, can you take care of people here in Lynchburg, Virginia? Absolutely, I can. Well, tell me what you can do for Washington State. Like, you mean Washington, D.C.? I'm trying to change their statement because I don't have an answer for that. And I tried to have an answer for that, but, it's very difficult to get two PTs to agree on what quality looks like. And if you can't define quality, you have a really hard time defining value. And so that became a real challenge for me. So one of the things that I look for is a business that's large, but is mostly like 60 to 70% in one market. And they're out there. They're definitely out there. And, certainly because they're large, the hope is that they're self-insured. Worked with some that aren't self-insured that are a little more challenging. But it can be done with the right leverage. If they're large enough, they carry leverage that maybe PTs don't have. And I also would say the other thing that limited me, and I've seen it limit others, is people are going, we don't have enough therapists to handle all this. And, like you're talking to a business that has a reach of 10,000 covered lives, which might be 3,500 employees. But when you add dependents, depending on what your inclusion criteria are, you're thinking this could be 10,000 people. I can't handle 10,000 visits or 10,000 visits times 2 times 6 weeks. Like, I can't manage that, but that's not how the world works. I mean, honestly, if the world did work like that, none of us would need to do this stuff. We would all be so busy and so well paid, it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's been an interesting challenge, and maybe we'll have you speak to this. I know a lot of practice owners, they flip flop between two realities, right? There's a well, I don't know that I have enough time to go out and acquire these contracts or put the work into sales, and then at the same time they say, well, even if I got the sales, how would I treat them? Everybody wants more volume from better paying sources with less admin burden, and so kind of, I think, a scarcity mindset that can sometimes get in the way of getting started. What was your experience? Was this a tough sell internally? Did this have to be as the CEO, president of the practice? Did you just have to take this on as your pet project and say, I'm dragging y'all with me? How did that go?
I was deep down the rabbit trail before I shared with even my partners like what I was working on, because I wasn't sure what was going to exist and what wasn't going to exist. And once we got close, we weren't quite there. Then, I said, hey, everybody, I'd like to talk to you about my harebrained idea. And this is how I see it working. But we, in the beginning, there in the early stages, we did things in a very safe manner, but very different, at least in, 14 years ago, than what most people were doing. Most people in a direct to employer contract, they were going on site to an employer. I was struggling because the PTs that I had that were willing to go on site, I was a little nervous about letting them go on site. They were good people, but, they didn't really have the best value proposition. Good therapist, quality, but had a hard time managing their own schedules. And, so like, I'm going to complicate it by getting you to go off site. I'm a little afraid that I could leave with egg on my face. So I wanted it to be near site versus on site, where we created changes in the pathways of the way people sought healthcare, not physical therapy. Some of it was truly healthcare. They would say it was a musculoskeletal problem, but in our initial portion of our evaluation, we determined like this is a medical condition. like we had too many red or yellow flags, like we should be referring. That brought on a whole nother thought. And it was like, okay, now who do I refer them to? This person doesn't have a doctor. Like probably 30 or 40% of the people that we saw in that scenario didn't have a primary care physician. Uh, Sending them to the ER wasn't a smart financial move. And certainly the employer would be upset with me if I did that. So eventually I found ways to partner with primary care doctors and make a package deal. And because some of these things could be managed with musculoskeletal care, and some of these things needed medicinal care or at least education beyond a scope that I was comfortable with our team providing. Obviously, we can handle some nutritional things and weight loss things and those, but I can't look at you and tell you what your A1C is.
Right.
Look at you and guess that it's not good, but not to the point of saying this is the medication you should probably be. That's not in our scope. So I needed to create relationships with people that also saw that same value proposition and to make those trade-offs. And I learned by what was coming in the door. And again, all of this was happening as direct access was developing, and we were seeing ourselves as primary care providers and needing to communicate. And you had to teach that, right? I mean, the at that point in time, just sending a patient back to a physician, most of the time, if you listened, just acutely listened in the clinic, that said, look, I think you should go to see a doctor about that. And then that was it. Like first, that does not absolve your liability. You have a responsibility and a liability to this patient to deliver them to a person who can care for them. And by the way, anybody who refers to you writes down the reasons why they're making a referral, and they send it in a paper form or a digital form of paper to you, so you know why they're there. Like we should be doing the same thing.
I love
It
it.
was, it was,
Yeah.
today it sounds commonplace, but back then it was like, what are you talking about? Yeah.
Yeah. What you managed to do in that model, and what is so exciting about the opportunity of a direct contractor relationship, is really you inserted physical therapy as the primary care provider for musculoskeletal, but you also recognized in a very intelligent way, we are primary care providers for MSK conditions, but being in a primary care position is going to put more surface area or exposure for a lot of other health conditions, some of which you're very well equipped to manage, others you might not be. And you just became a referrer. And that has always been my biggest pet peeve with us as an industry. We've always thought of ourselves as this end node provider that we just receive. And referrals are the currency of healthcare. And so by putting physical therapy in a position to refer out, you've changed the power dynamic in such a powerful way that, to your point, you're now seeing really strong partnerships with direct primary care and other specialty areas. I'm curious, in your experience, as you've looked for the right place to start, pun not intended, which door to open, right? There's typically two paths to go and work with an employer. Either the work comp safety angle or the health plan, group health kind of angle. What have you found, and what has been the entry path that you guys have primarily been?
I'm on the general health side, not the workers' comp side. And there's really two reasons for that. One, other people are already in that space and doing it differently, doing it in a way that I'm sure brought value, but I didn't feel the value. The other reason is when I was speaking to employers, they would talk about health spend on the workers' comp side as a flat line. And it really has been flat over the last 10 years. If you go back and look at the data, although the number of injuries in the work comp space has reduced 35% in that time frame. And so the employer's fine with it because it didn't change the budget. And it's just always been there. It's been there long enough now that we're kind of numb to it. I look at that and go, you're not recognizing that the cost per visit for managing a workers' comp claim is exponentially increasing. It's 35% higher. But they didn't care. What they did care about, particularly post 2012, is holy smoke, I got the same insurance. We didn't really have that many claims. Everything was well maintained in the year. So I thought we were going to be flat, and it went up 15, 16%. And there was some definitive fallout with some positives to the ACA, but there's some definitive fallout as well. And that made me recognize that the real payer of health benefits is not an insurance company, it's an employer. And so I just had to think differently. I had to talk differently to them, talk like a business person, not like a physical therapist. And then if the opportunity arose, insert a physical therapy solution.
Now, I have to ask it, especially given when this podcast is being reported or being recorded in the last month. Hinge Health files for their S1 to go public. Obviously, there's been a lot of players in this space that really, to be fair to them, I mean, they beat us to the punch in a lot of ways at scale, right? They went directly after this problem that employers were having, and they utilized physical therapy as a core piece of their intervention. While they aren't referring to themselves as digital physical therapy clinics anymore, go figure. They still utilize physical therapy as a big piece of their value proposition. And I know it's made a lot of brick and mortar therapists a little bit concerned, right? They look at this as a competitive threat, or they say, why would I even bother going to sell to employers when they're already buying these digital solutions? What has your experience been? Sounds like, I mean, you were really selling before the advent of the digital MSK. Now you've been selling right through this time period where they've kind of become popular. What has your experience been in the interaction with the digital groups?
I do think digital exercise tells a big story, right? Not digital physical therapy. And there's a big difference in that. And it's our job to explain that. I would also say inexpensive and high value are not the same things. There are people who will buy an inexpensive car, and as long as they expect to get an inexpensive car, they're satisfied. And I think there's a spot for that. There are other people that if they don't care what the car costs, as long as they get the luxury that they're expecting for that dollar amount, they're also satisfied. Where people break down is when the cost exceeds the value. And that's our responsibility to deliver patient experience, patient outcome, and for a price that allows that equation to be successful. And I think that's really our opportunity. We would think in-person physical therapy has great experience. It's person to person. We're empathetic. We're good listeners. We put our hands on our patients, those types of things. That sounds good, but it takes a lot of time. And that's where digital exercise companies are successful. It's fast, it's easy, it's literally access wherever you're sitting on your phone, on your computer, and stuck in rush hour traffic. Whatever it is, it's easy to access, and it's not that expensive in a per click basis. So we have to recognize that people think that's a good patient experience. It's not the way we view it, but other people do. The variable that we have is patient outcome. Because if we're doing it right, and this is certainly my opinion, but we have the opportunity to measure functional ability at initial contact with the patient, initial evaluation, and over a series of times through the course of care. And if we're doing it right, their concomitant sign is changing. Their price becomes less important because the value is going up because the outcome is going up. And that's where we need to capitalize. And that's what physical therapy is always purported to be very good at. Here's our opportunity to prove it.
Love it. I love it. Well, as we get towards the end here, for anybody who is starting to take the first steps down a pathway towards direct contracting, especially direct contracting with employers, if you were going to give them kind of one take-home message about, how to get started or the number one piece of advice you'd give them, what might that be?
Don't be afraid to talk to people about healthcare. If you can just get yourself comfortable with addressing business leaders in particular, the C-suite employees, about healthcare, you'll hear some very entrepreneurial mindsets. You'll find some people that are looking to make changes, and you just might have just opened the door for yourself. And I have one contract with a large employer, 8,500 to 10,000 employees, but it's a busy place and it's hard to get in and out of. And I was talking to the senior leadership about it, and they said, why don't we just use Uber? We'll just pay an Uber to get them to your office. That had never occurred to me. I do not live in a metropolitan area. I'm like, do we have enough Ubers? Yeah, I don't even know. But it had never occurred to me that you wouldn't walk from your desk or your workplace to your car and drive to whatever appointment you had, because rush hour where I live adds 7 minutes, and so it didn't make any sense to me. But I didn't work in a place that I parked a half a mile away from my desk, and so that came up in conversation. Like we're just talking about how can we make it better. And the senior leadership is the one who saw that. And they said, we can get them to you easy.
I love it.
Perfect. And let's do more of it.
A perfect example of when you have an aligned buyer who at the end of the day knows the problem that they're trying to solve. Amazing what creative solutions, you're really just talking about the little barriers that are getting in the way of the big picture value. And
Sure.
yeah, that aligned buyer will sure be willing to try all sorts of things to get to the end goal you both agree on.
And you don't know who's aligned until you talk to them. And
Amen.
and don't sell physical therapy, sell musculoskeletal primary care. And we're not competing with orthopedic surgeons. We don't do orthopedic surgery. We are not competing with primary care doctors. We are working beside primary care doctors. And we're not competing with the director of HR. We're trying to make their life easier. We're not competing with safety directors at employers. We're trying to keep people healthy so there are no safety issues. So we're all like-minded anyway. Like by nature, what we have to do is find the common ground of who has a problem and who can deliver a solution.
Said perfectly. Well, Josh, thank you so much for joining us today and giving a quick overview of your experience diving into direct contracting, the role of direct care overall in your practice's growth, and providing some practical how-tos. I sense that there's going to have to be a follow-up part two in the future because I know there's so many more paths that we could take here to understand some of the specifics. But as an intro to this, I think this was tremendous. I'm hopeful that direct care can you picked a date of 2037. Well, we certainly hope to continue to be helping the profession long through that date. Boy, that feels like a long time from now. And so I'd love for direct contracting to be a hopeful solution in the interim while we build towards that.
Yeah, I think it has to be. If we wait till 2037, we're all going to have a problem. And so now is the time. And I would love to have a part two. I love to hear other people's perspective. So maybe I have to interview you.
All right, we'd always be down for that. Well, Josh, thank you so much, man. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll be sure to follow up again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.